Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bharat Joshi, and I am a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. I warmly welcome you all to another edition of the ICS Wednesday seminar titled A Chinatown in Celluloid Geographies. The title of today's seminar is unique and intriguing that blends urban space, ethnic identity, and cinematic representation. Chinatown refers not just to a physical ethnic enclave, but to a symbolic space shaped by migration, labor, and cultural memory. In this context, it evokes the presence of ethnic Chinese communities in cities like Mumbai, where who were integral to urban histories. Cellular geography suggests the cinematic portrayal of spatial and cultural mapping. The talk explores how Hindi language cinema has historically embraced the ethnic Chinese. These individuals often appeared as background laborers or extras, yet their reduced presence on screen hints at deeper histories of migration, trade, and persecution. So, a Chinatown in cellular geographies is not a literal place, but a cinematic and historical lens through which we can reimagine forgotten narratives, especially those that challenge dominant India China geopolitical framework. The speaker for today's session is Miss Navnidhi Sharma, who is a doctoral scholar in cinema studies at New York University. Her doctoral research weaves together the story of India and China with that of popular cultural production in India. Through the archive of Indian cinema and print in the 20th century, she considers how China India history is shaped by and in turn shapes the history of popular cultural production in India. The chair for today's discussion is Professor Avijit Banerjee, who is a professor in Chinese and head of the Department of Chinese Language and Culture, China Bhavan, at Vishwabharati University. Professor Banerjee completed a PhD in Chinese language and literature from Vishwabharati. He studied in China at Beijing Language University during 1996-1997 under the India-China Bilateral Cultural Exchange Program. Professor Banerjee has authored many articles and chapters in several volumes and co edited two books titled India in the Eyes of the Chinese Youth in April 2016 and China Through the Eyes of Indian Youths in 2017. Professor Banerjee's research interests include Chinese language and India China cultural studies. Professor Banerjee has most recently translated a book titled Doctor and Internationalist Dwarkanath Kotnis, a memorial volume from Bengali into Chinese. So, before I hand over to the chair, I would like all the participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants shall be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and official affiliation. Alternatively, you may also use a raise your hand option during the interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. Thank you. I now hand over to the chair. Over to you, Professor Avijit Banerjee. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Bharat, for the wonderful introduction. And also, it's a pleasure to be at this ICS weekly seminar. Today's topic is really interesting. Mrs. Navnidhi Sharma will be talking on the Chinatown in celluloid geography. We have a bit of knowledge also on the films that we have seen. The films, the Indian films on China, for example, or most of you know, which were also most of the films that we know are in the Calcutta based. For example, if we know the film on Howrah Bridge or the Neel Akashe Niche, like this many. So it's a wonderful thing that we have to see that how these representations reveal something interesting to us about the Chinese lives in India. So uh, if we see, for example, the Howrah Bridge, which is not just a bridge, but it's a bridge between South Asia, China, the migrated laborers. The significance of the film is much deep, and how these migrant workers moved with relative ease and freedom in search of livelihood and fortune. So these are many interesting things we can find in these films. In the recent days, also we have seen some films which are coming up, and as Kolkata, the we can say that Tangra or places, some other places in Kolkata which where the Chinese, the ethnic Chinese stayed. Uh, had a lot of population, but these days it is coming down. So we are all very much interested in hearing what Navnidhi will speak on this Chinatown in celluloid geography. Without any much ado, I will ask Navnidhi to please speak and deliver his address. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Banerjee, and for everyone who's attending. I'm so grateful for you taking out the time to come and hear this talk, and particularly to Professor Banerjee for this introduction and for agreeing to chair this talk. Before I launch into my topic, I think I want to talk about like the where this work came, how the thought of doing this work came around. So, you know, for me, the question was, my bigger dissertation is about writing a history of India and China through popular visual and print culture, mainly cinema. And as I went on to write this history about India and China, I realized that it was becoming a history about these two abstract things called India and China that don't, I mean, they're nations, but in a way they're not people, they're not human, they're just these big things that, you know, a historical kind of realities that shape lives. And as I kept watching these films, many of them, including the ones that you mentioned, Professor Banerjee, Howrah Bridge, Neel Akash Niche, I realized that, yes, there are films that have been made about in which the Chinese residents of India have been represented. But then as I kept watching more films, I realized there are films in which they are themselves there. And that's really the topic of this presentation today. It's the Chinese who lived in Bombay and worked in these films, and what I have been able to find out the fragments of their life. So with that, I'll just begin. Which is to say that this talk is based on my archival research into lost films and forgotten people. I say lost films because much of the Indian cinematic archive is now lost. A lot of films have just simply been lost to time because they were made of the celluloid material, which did not survive and was never kept by the archive. Specifically, the forgotten people, and specifically are the community of Indian Chinese or the Chinese or the Indians of Chinese descent. What I'm attempting to do is I'm trying to write the story into the history of the city that they lived in. My interest is in Bombay, now Mumbai. Bombay and its cinema, the Hindi Urdu film that is today more popularly called Bollywood. So I'm going to share my presentation. Okay, just I just is my could someone confirm if the presentation is visible and
Yes, ma'am, it is visible.
okay, great. Sorry. Sorry about that. Just, okay. I want to start with a clip from this 1957 film called Gateway of India. As a short context, what you're going to see on the screen is so this film, it takes place within a single night. The actress Madhubala, who many of you may recognize, she's playing an heiress who's on the run. And she must, in the course of that single night, she must survive the gritty underbelly of Bombay. She runs into a succession of predatory men, among whom she also meets one who is an aged widower, played by Bhagwan Dada, who's here on the extreme right bottom of the screen. And this aged widower, we find out that he murdered all 6 of his past wives. But at this point, she's already run into his house and has little chance of escape. So the quick-witted heroine convinces him of her returned interest in his advances. And very quickly, the scene dissolves into a fantasy sequence. The background music turns vaguely what we might call Oriental. The sounding of a gong opens to shots of shadowy pavilions and dragons dressed in a gleaming silk tangchuang. The heroine starts moving with short steps as if she's treading with bound feet. And the old man, now sporting a condensed Fu Manchu mustache and dressed in a robe that is embroidered with dragons, breaks out into a song about his flights of fancy. So far, an Orientalist fantasy sequence is not an unfamiliar presence on the Hindi film screen. But what happens next is truly, I think, a singular event for Hindi cinema. A group of children burst out into chorus in fluent Chinese. Ni lala woman the tifang, ni kwaila woman ye kwaila. You have come to our place, our home. We are happy that you are happy. So I'm just going to show the clip to you and continue from there. Okay, so sorry. Authentic Chinese language lyrics jolt this fantasy sequence into a new dimension. Who are these words meant for, and how did they end up in a song otherwise wholly unconcerned with realism? The song's production history provides a clue. A women's delegation from People's Republic of China was visiting Bombay in January 1957 and was invited to the sets for a screening of this special Chinese song and dance number. The song then is a relic of its time and belongs to a short window of contact between India and the PRC before the relationship disintegrated and the two countries went to war in 1962. It is therefore, the song becomes a meeting point between China as an imagination and as a geopolitical reality, an unwitting encounter between an official delegation from 1950s China and the wildly ahistorical and uncomfortably racist imaginary on the Indian screen. But mediating this encounter, providing the labor and acting as a cultural bridge, are Bombay's community of the Indian Chinese. These are some publicity stills from the film. We can see how Chineseness is used as a point of what we call in cinema studies attraction. So if we look at the center of the screen, if we look at the main protagonist and their setting, the story is one of racialized representation from the well-worn template of Orientalist imagination. But if we start looking at or tracking our gazes to the margins of the screen, to the background dancers and to the children, we get new protagonists for whom the simple claim of belonging, woman the tifang, our home or our place, is complicated by their position as individuals existing at the interstices of race and nation. The ethnic Chinese who performed labor as extra or as junior artists exist at the edges of the screen and of cinematic practice, but also at the margins of the city and the nation. But my effort today is to show that they are in fact not marginal, but integral to the history of Bombay and to its cinema, even though the traces of their historical presence are now lost to time. Narrated through overarching frameworks like nations and geographies and geopolitics, the sweep and scale of modern India-China history obscures ordinary historical subjects. By attending to the ethnic Chinese who worked lowest on the labor hierarchy, we can ask how India and China are entangled beyond geopolitical linkages through histories of migration, gendered and racialized bodies, and questions of labor. The presence of Chinese communities in India, many of us in the room today will know, intertwines with 19th century colonial commerce and is inextricable from the upheaval of wars and nationhood. These communities swelled through the 20th century through subsequent wars and communist revolution in China, impelling more Chinese to migrate and settle in the port cities of Calcutta and Bombay. Marked by racial difference and persecuted after the India-China War of 1962, they suffered the worst excesses of state and public anger. These Chinatowns have since been reduced to a fraction in waves of outward migration. All of which is to say, Hindi language cinema from Bombay is thus an archive of a disappearing community. Once I began looking for traces of ethnic Chinese on the screen, their racially inscribed presence made them visible in otherwise invisible parts. The difficulty, however, was that their cinematic archive documents their image, but not their identity. My challenge was how to trace people in a paradox, both hyper visible yet unknown. The song booklet of a now lost B film, Chini Jadugar, The Chinese Magician, provided the first clue. At the bottom of the credits page, below the film's animal stars Moti the dog and Ustad the horse, but above the nondescript extras, the idiomatically phrased China Party is credited as supplied by someone named Musa. This now lost fantasy genre B film from 1959 then had enough Chinese performers to merit the collective term party, whose images and identities are now lost with the film. And so I began looking for Musa, who I eventually found to be hiding in plain sight. Raj Kapoor's Avara is well known across the second and the third worlds, particularly the former Soviet Union, Turkey, Middle East, Africa. It also has the distinction of seeing two waves of massive success in China. First in the mid-50s during the high tide of India-China relations, and again resurrecting its success at the end of the Cultural Revolution in the late 1970s. This story, I'm sure, is known to most of us. Obscured in an uncredited bit part, Musa Chang plays the protagonist Raj, played by Raj Kapoor, his friend, his vagrant criminal friend. In Avara, we first catch a glimpse of him impeccably dressed in a dark suit and tie, gambling with the other Chinese in the swirling smoke of Jagga's den in the song Ek Do Teen. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but he's right here at the bottom right, almost. In Avara, we catch a glimpse of him. He appears more prominently 2 scenes later, right before Raj steals Rita's purse, as Raj and him stand scoping the crowd for the likely victim. Musa stands, as he would in many other parts, just off the protagonist's shoulder in the frame, but rarely alone. So for those of you who've seen the film, you would recognize this part.
ओके मुझे 11 बजे पहुंचना है। एक फर्स्ट क्लास गाड़ी वो सो रही। ड्राइवर कहा उसका तो पता नहीं। एक लड़की उतर कर सामने की दुकान में गई है, उसके पास होगी वो।
Okay, so close to 6 feet tall, with deep-set eyes, high cheekbones, and a broad forehead topped with a thick crop of hair, Musa's striking looks were made for the screen. Musa was born Fusan Chang sometime in the 1920s, either in Calcutta or in China. His family of peasants came from Tiananmen and Hubei, making a difficult trek through Burma, like many others who arrived from China to India in the early 20th century. His father was a wushu martial arts expert who came to Calcutta and finally settled in Bombay's Chinapada in Kamatipura and took up dentistry. Though film career was not considered good work, Musa began working in films from his teens, adopting the name Musa as his screen name, the same name by which he was known in the neighborhood of Kamatipura where he grew up. While the time and place of his birth, along with most details of his life, are now lost, what remains is a filmography scattered over 4 decades. His name would remain unknown, but his face would be a familiar presence in numerous big and small banners, like RK, that's Raj Kapoor's banner, Navketan, Sippy Films, and others. He remained on the fringes of the industry, surviving by small roles throughout his long career, which most likely, or the earliest that I have been able to find at least, began with Roti, that's the Mehboob film. Oh, sorry. Sorry, which most likely began with Roti and ended in the late 1970s. The last that I know that has him in it is Rafu Chakar from, I think that's 75. A complete filmography of his work is hard to achieve given the fragmented nature of his presence in the credits. I surmise his body of work may be far larger than the films I have been able to identify. Musa Chang is perhaps the most prominent of Indian Chinese cineworkers, but he's not alone. With more searching, others began to show up unexpectedly in crowds, in boats and asylums, in shadowy lairs as henchmen and criminals, and even as the police, as guests in a nightclub, as orphan children, as dentists. And this image, of course, many of you, I'm sure, would recognize because it's relatively recent. This is from Gangubai Kathiawadi. The actor that you see in this picture is Mr. Joseph Yuan, who is still active and still works, as well as in many advertisements. This is for the noodle brand Ching's with Mr. Shen Kao, who is also an actor actively working at present. Sometimes their presence means something for the plot, usually by virtue of their other racial and by implication national status. And other times, their Chinese identity is of little or no significance. Aside from cinema, the Chinese performed across India in various genres of embodied performance. For example, I came across a news item from Kota in October 1978. Massive crowd gathered for a fight between Dara Singh and a Chinese wrestler named Chini Chattan, the Chinese rock mountain. The news of that bout spread with the knowledge that the fight will be held between wrestlers from India and China. More than the fight itself, the audience were eager to see the Chinese fighter who had posed a challenge to the fabled prowess of Dara Singh. In truth, no wrestlers had been brought in from China. This is 1978. The opposing team had in fact come from Bombay. When word got out, the audience was reportedly unwilling to believe that the wrestler, the muscular, fit-complexioned Chini Chattan, was from Bombay. To this date, the news piece says, a thrill goes through people while recounting that match, and the lore persists that after the wrestler from China lost his nerve, the organizers had to bring in a wrestler from Bombay. Who was Chini Chattan? I don't know. But I do know of the wrestler Appy Chang, who participated in wrestling bouts also with the likes of Dara Singh. The lone surviving advertisement of his fighting career is this well-creased pamphlet. Chang is advertised as Mighty and Chang, champion of Hong Kong. He's there in the middle towards the right with a bare chest and bulging muscles. Ethnic and Chinese and national difference were heightened in the wrestling arena as a matter of bodily contest. So Mighty and Chang is one among a range of fighters, the masked and caped Dr. Death, winner of South American tournament, Omar Sharif, champion of Iran, the fez cap wearing Abdullah the Turk, undefeated, and other worthies. Appy Chang was born Changming Pi, and he worked in films starting the late 1970s. He was often cast as the burly henchman. You may have seen him in the film Satte Pe Satta. He's the one who throws the first punch in the bar fight scene with Amitabh Bachchan and his brothers. In writing about the history of these performers, the main challenge is that is the lack of their presence in the archive. There are no magazines with interviews or profiles like there are for stars. What remains are fragments of memories with their surviving families. In the absence of an archival presence of those who remain at the edges of cinematic practice, my approach and practice and partly also my argument is that the histories of Bombay city, its cinema, and its Chinese residents are enmeshed. And so to find their lost history, we can traverse the city's own origins. To put it another way, since many of these actors are now gone and very few archival traces remain, we can try to understand something of their life by understanding the broader history of the Chinese in Bombay, on the assumption that people like Musa and Appy Chang led a life similar to an ordinary Chinese in Bombay. In trying to excavate this history, I realized it is tied together with the story of the China trade within the city's own origins. To illustrate, let me return momentarily to Gateway of India to explain what I'm trying to say. Our intrepid heroine escapes each of the predatory men with a promised rendezvous at Bombay's most well-known monument, the Gateway of India that we can see in the back. Now, the Gateway, as I'm sure most of us know, is a grandiose arch commissioned in 1911 to commemorate the landing and entrance of King George V and Queen Mary to Bombay, the British Crown's foremost center of commerce. Few remember, however, that there once stood a pavilion at the same site where the gateway stands today. Designed by the British architect George Ormiston in the image of the China-Burma style of architecture, that's, quote, it's how they called it, all new arrivals by sea entered Bombay through this pavilion, which stood at 100 feet long with arched roofs and 24 columns ornamented with carvings. That Bombay should have a pavilion in the Orientalist quote-unquote Chinese style is highly surprising. After all, it was the capital from the China trade of opium and cotton that filled the coffers of the city. These gains produced a new industrial class of the Parsis, indigenous traders, who turned into wealthy financiers of the Parsi theatre. So the capital from China trade undergirded both the building of Bombay city as well as of the spheres of cultural performance and entertainment. The Grant Road Theatre, also known as Playhouse, which was later hybridized as Pillar House, was built in 1846. The backers of this project included Framji Kawasji, who made his fortunes trading cotton to China and had brought the earliest Chinese workmen to Bombay to his factory in Powai. Jagannath Shankar Seth, prominent city businessman, and Jamsetji Gigi Boy, who had hegemony over the opium market with Jardine Matheson and company, were the backers for this project. So Grant Road Theatre hosted troops from abroad as well as local troops, including Parsi amateur theatre groups, but had folded up by 1877-78. However, what it did was it opened the door for other theatres, which led to the entire area itself being called Pila House. Now, as most of you know, or as many of you know, Parsi theatre was the forerunner of Bombay cinema, what we call Bollywood today. The fortunes of the China trade cascaded down generations to reach early filmmakers, the best known example of which is seen in the emblem of the production house Wadia Movietone. If you look at their insignia, it is a sailing ship at sea. This was inspired by the crest of the family, built with the fortunes of JBH and Homi Wadia, who are the founders of Wadia Movietone. And just as a way of introduction to those of you who may not know about the history of Bombay cinema, these are one of the founders, you can say, of early film in India. They made a lot of famous stunt films. So this sailing ship at sea, right? This is inspired by the crest of the family, built with the fortunes of their great-grandfather, Loji Wadia, whose ships made passage for the East India Company between Canton and Bombay. Now, Wadia Movietone is a suitable point of departure, I think, to consider the role of China trade in laying the foundation of theatre and film spheres in Bombay. It was the Wadias who built HMS Cornwallis, which was the flagship of the British fleet in the China Seas during the Opium War. The Treaty of Nanking, ceding Hong Kong to British, was signed aboard the Cornwallis in 1842. So does all of this, these backgrounds, do they translate into any kind of cinema that comes out? That was the question for me, until I found out that the Wadia's 1937 lost film, Navjawan, it is now only remembered as a colossal commercial failure. It happened to be the first Hindi film, and for a very long time, the last Hindi film that experimented with having no songs. The film's infamy includes a pandemonium that broke loose in Delhi's Jubilee Theatre, with the audience thundering, Wadia ne loot liya. Wadia has looted us, throwing stones, breaking chairs, and pulling down the curtains. Collective memory has actually forgotten what this film was about. It so happens that this film is the story of a trader, Seth Chimanlal, returning with untold wealth from China. So the plot revolves around a villainous Chinese man called Chang Ling attempting to recover this wealth. The film then moves through the background of Chinese restaurants and cafes and pits the hero against a gang of people called the Chang Gang. While Parsi magician Meenu the Mystic plays Chang Ling in yellow face, you can see him there at the top of the poster on the left. We can only speculate if the Bombay Chinese played the junior and background artists, like, for example, the Chang Gang. Unfortunately, we will never know, but it is only a way that we can write the Bombay Chinese into the history of early film by speculating that these are the kind of films that they were very likely in, even before Musa Chang or any of the others who started in the 40s, right? There are other within early cinema that officially titled Black Thief translates to the Chinese money lender. Incidentally, the poster mentions, the quality isn't great, but if you look at the poster on the left, you can see that one of the people that it has is a Musa. I have no idea if this is the same Musa. If it is, he would have been a teenager at this time, which kind of makes it unlikely that he would be billed on an entire poster. But even though he did begin working in films in his teens, the film promises exotic dances, thrilling climaxes, daring romance, staggering stunts, featuring scantily clad dancers, ambiguously racial in golden costumes. But the question is, who is the Chinese moneylender? At least, so the film is lost, but going by the poster, he seems to be the antagonist with sharp nails and a drooping mustache. Perhaps, like all moneylenders, he has trapped his creditors to bleed dry under loans from which they need rescuing by a masked hero. There is Mr. 420. This one was made in Calcutta. The song booklet sketches out a story revolving around corruption in a jute factory. The strange thing about this film is that while the story in the song booklet says nothing about Chinese, the poster, the one you can see here, and I have a few surviving stills, seem to have ethnic Chinese actors. Now, what is interesting, I think, for me, is that these stunt films dramatize in a highly sensational fashion a contentious transfer of capital and goods moving from Chinese hands to Indian, oddly or not so oddly, parallel to the trade and upheaval of the opium China trade. It is entirely possible, we can at least speculate, that it is in films like these that the Chinese settling in Bombay and Calcutta through the early 20th century would have performed. Now, unlike the Chinese community of Calcutta, the history of Chinese in Bombay is not as well recorded. As I dug through the archives about the building of Bombay, I found that the history of the Chinese is not only metaphorically, but literally subterranean. It lies under Bombay's land. So besides the aesthetic symbolism of buildings above ground, like that forgotten Burma Chinese pavilion, the very land on which Bombay stands was built by Chinese hands. The Elphinstone Land and Press Company, which reclaimed land from Apollo Bandar to Mazgaon, shipped 2,304 Chinese workers from Hong Kong to Bombay in early 1864. Together with native workers, Chinese carpenters, coolies, mistris, and masons performed the hard work of chiseling and molding stones into the right shape and size from reclamation work. The passage, the journey on the sea, had not been kind to them. A large number arrived sickly and dying. 38 died on passage, and another 537 died or deserted not long after. In the eyes of Elphinstone Company, these events were, and I quote, a serious loss of time and money. While many were shipped of these, the Cantonese workers were shipped back, still a large number remained in Bombay and settled in Bombay's Chinatown. So if we want to give, a kind of like a historic, what they call in Hindi Prishtabhumi, right? Like a historic backdrop to the workers that we see on cinema throughout the 20th century. This is the kind of wider arcs of history in which we can place them. But this is in 1864. But the history of Chinese in Bombay actually goes back decades before 1864. And if I may say so, their presence in Bombay, the presence of the Chinese in Bombay, is as old as Bombay city itself. The earliest reference that I found to the Chinese dates to 1826, when a visiting English lady described the mix of foreigners in Bombay belonging to every religion, every caste, and every profession of almost every nation, from the shore of China to the bank of Thames. By 1830, the Parsi trader Framji Kawasji, who had made his fortune through the China trade after successful visits to China, employed Chinese labor in a factory he set up in Powai to manufacture silk, tea, opium, and sugar. From the mid-1920s, the Chinese populate newspapers as cooks and butlers, dentists, silk hawkers, mechanics, sailors. Not all Chinese were of equal status. Some traded in silk and pearls or owned carpentry workshops, but underpaid hard labor was the reality of many who arrived in difficult and desperate circumstances. In Bombay, the Chinese settled in two areas. One is Mazgaon, which is called Old Chinatown. It's a district right next to the docks that became home to dock workers. But most Chinese lived and settled in the bazaar, the market area of Kamatipura, or New Chinatown. Now, Kamatipura lies in an almost perfect rectangle between what were earlier called Belasses Road, Duncan Road, Grant Road, and Suklaji Street. Right? So I dug a lot for like, what was Chinatown like? So when the British write, they bring their own gaze with it. So to British observers writing in newspapers in the early 20th century, this area was, quote, the least savory quarters of a very unsavory district. This, I mean, they kind of like, and write about it in very unflattering terms, also because Kamatipura had become Bombay's entertainment district. It had theaters, it had later cinemas, it had brothels. They were all wedged together in narrow and crowded lanes. It had kind of become an enclave of the marginalized, the low caste, the prostitute, the racially othered. As Ashwini Tambe notes, Kamatipura was, for the British, they called it native town, accessible but sufficiently set apart from the work and residential areas of Europeans in the city, mapping racial divisions and social hierarchies onto the spatial territories of Bombay. But separated by time and culture, observations vary. To its Chinese residents, Chinatown of the mid-20th century was a lively place. The Chinese had grocery stores where they sold herbs, shoe shops where wooden sandals could be bought, a meat shop, shops selling roast pork, Chinese snacks. Kamatipura's Lokchun restaurant, which opened in 1895, was one of the two earliest Chinese restaurants in Bombay. Hawkers would sell fish bone soup carried in two pots hung on opposite sides of a pole balanced on a shoulder. Hawkers pitching their wares even at night time. Others would bring silk cloths on a cycle, displaying it to customers in their homes. Prawn and fish would be dried on the sidewalk. There were also opium dens. So to bring all of this together, right, the title of this talk, A Chinatown in Celluloid Geographies, it's kind of inspired by the home that the Chinese made for themselves in Kamatipura, however difficult the circumstances of life that they had come from, in the permanent way in which they settled and became a part of Bombay. And I think that if we situate the Chinese on the screen in the real world in which they lived, it might help us understand something about their desire or their impetus towards being a part of cinema. And I think Kamatipura had a role also to play in that. So this is a map that one of my friends drew for me very quickly. And my request to him was, can you tell me how many cinema halls there are in Kamatipura? So within Kamatipura, if you see at the bottom of the map towards the left, you see Suklaji Street. Most Chinese settled in Suklaji Street, which joins Grant Road. Grant Road is where if you remember a few slides ago, I spoke about where the Playhouse had opened and many theaters opened after that, right? And by theaters, I mean, in the beginning, they were for the performance of theater and plays of the Parsi theater. But cinema came to Bombay in 1896 at the turn of the century. The real culture of cinema viewing took off in great measure only after Bombay city started. So if you've seen the map of Bombay, it's like a long city. And at the bottom, Fort and Colaba is where the British stayed. Right, but cinema viewing in Bombay really only takes off after Bombay starts expanding northwards into these areas. And some of the biggest transformations happened in this area, where many theaters that had come up in the vicinity of Pila House begin to transform from avenues of theater to cinema halls. And they mushroom all over this area, right? So in this map, you can see like the working theaters and the closed theaters, but the sheer amount of theaters, and this is obviously hand-drawn. If we were able to go another 2 kilometers from this, there are even more theaters, right? So the early 30s is precisely the period that cinema transitioned from silent to talkies, and Bombay becomes the center of gravity for the Hindi-Urdu film. So much of that was due to the culture of cinema going, the nerve center of which was this area. So, I mean, putting all that together, right, I have no way to know, why did an artist like Musa decide to go to the films? Why did anyone who wants to be in the films? So arriving in Bombay in the late 1920s, perhaps, or early 1930s, I imagine that a young Musa's earliest memories would have been of being surrounded by a sea of cinema halls around his home in this dense urban agglomeration. So, this is one way of situating them in the city as geographically, but also in terms of like the celluloid geographies of the city itself, right? Through the early 20th century, the Chinese continued to migrate and established a permanent community, a home in Bombay. A Chinese newspaper was printed in Bombay Central. A school was set up in Agripada in 1930. From here on out, I'm sure most of you know the course of the difficult history in the 20th century. After the India-China War of 1962, around 3,000 Chinese were sent to internment facility in Rajasthan for 5 long years. Many others were forced to board ships and migrate back to China. Many left India in the years that followed, and several narratives have in fact emerged from within the community, including some documentaries. Musa remained in Bombay, but I haven't been able to find out what happened to his career in the immediate years after the war. He resurfaces in the late 1960s in a number of spy films, playing the local hand of a shadowy international network. His name, earlier just Musa, was sometimes now written in song booklets as Musa China, which was sometimes spelt with a double E and sometimes as Musa China, welding his Chinese identity to the name. So I'm just almost coming to the end of my talk, but I want to end with a few thoughts on labor. Labor, just in the sense of like the hard work that is done in the process of filmmaking. Indian Chinese actors took place at the margins of cinema, both in the industry and extras, and as characters on the screen. But their labor, though invisible, was not insubstantial. Being an extra is not easy work. Writing in Filmfare magazine in 1952, an extra writes about living dirt poor in slums, experiencing the lack of regular work, having to tramp his way to different studios and suppliers in the hope of a day's work, queuing up for paltry sums of money, being ordered about on the sets, waiting outside for hours, sharing makeup rooms, and being crowded together and mistreated on the sets. So the figure of the Chinese quote unquote extra, right, the Chinese junior artist, it holds many stories together. And those who are marginalized within the marginalized are harder to track. Musa Chang, he had the certification to practice dentistry like many other Hubei Chinese, but his interest lay only in cinema. He would spend day after day in film offices, waiting for a job that would come once every few months. On that day, he would be, as his son told me, on top of the world. But the task of bringing up his 8 children fell upon his wife, who learnt dentistry to sustain their existence. There are other women on the screen, as well as off the screen, who are sometimes a fleeting image in these films, or their story is entirely hidden behind the scenes, which I think still remains untold. Thank you. So, I mean, just as you know, I'm done with my presentation, and I just want to say this is a kind of a glimpse from one of the chapters I'm writing. There are more shades, more contours to this story, although I've left a lot unexplored. But I have to convey my thanks to the people from the community who shared their experiences and stories with me, Mr. Chang Cho Ni, Mr. Joseph Yan, and Mr. Chan Shan Kao. I'm continuing to try and put this story together more, but this is kind of a glimpse of how far I've gotten, right? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Navneeti. Wonderful presentation. I think most of us were not aware of many things which you have tried to present today, in spite of the difficulties that there are not much accounted documents or not much thing you can get in the archives. But still, I think this is a very interesting presentation. And let's see if anything has come in the question in the chat box. Bharat, anything is there? Just or anyone
Not yet,
can,
sir.
yeah, anyone can make some comments. Actually, this is one of the lecture, I think, which many are unaware of what are the things that are happening. Actually, Kolkata Chinese, maybe there are some books are also there, 2, 3 books are there, and some documentations are also there in the archives in the West Bengal archival section. Also, we can find something. In spite of the fact that from the period between 62 and 70s, these things are not there. But still, it's wonderful. You have mentioned today about some of the characters. Yeah, some of the films which we feel, which the China has been projected, which I was mentioning, which were based in West Bengal, there were no Chinese actors, all of the Indian actors. So this is a very interesting that Musa and some other which you are mentioning. Uh, Presently, I am telling you, presently there are some Indian actors, the Chinese, Indian Chinese, who are in this West Bengal films. 2, 3 people, one daughter and his father. Some they are coming. The last 2, 3 years back, uh, these films are now they have come. So few people are now there like this Chinese. Moreover, one Chinese from Chiang Rai is there, who is a very famous person who is playing the guitar in a very famous band in West Bengal. So these are in the recent time talking about the last 10 years. But again, the problem came when this COVID comes, and huge number of Chinese they left India after the COVID. Many people died, and their children who are staying in Canada or Australia, they took their parents to their place. So it has also come down. I think in Mumbai also it has come down drastically, as you are saying that there are very few people, very few Chinese are in Mumbai. I think some place was there in some a cemetery probably in central Mumbai, which is I'm not sure about the name, but a cemetery is there in central Mumbai, which shows, which explain the Chinese presence. And yeah, that's right. That we have documented history that the person who came to Calcutta first, we know the name, but in Mumbai there is not specific. You are mentioning of 20s, 30s, 1820, 1830. So during that period, that from other accounts, other scholars' accounts, we can know that besides many other foreigners, Chinese were also there, but not specific accounts are there. So the only way that you are trying, it's very wonderful that interviewing some of the people or the first generation, the second generation people, you can know some data. In that way, it's interesting. So I think this one is really a wonderful one. And the Chinese in India, whether it is in Mumbai or in Calcutta or in other place, they are definitely a very important component or a very important part of India's culture. They were not only in the business but also in the culture. If you see the trade, we all know the trade. They were flourishing trade by the Chinese and the Indians. Also, you mentioned the Parsi people who, through the China trade, they got rich. Not only that, the culture also we have seen how are amalgamated. So so in the culture, in the trade, the Indian Chinese have contributed a lot. So these are instances, especially in these two cities. If we go to these two cities, we can see. And I think so. Anything, Bharat? Any question? Anybody else? Any comments? Anyone want to make a comment? Maybe someone is there. Oh, I think Alka ma'am has raised hand and want to make some comment.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks.
ma'am,
Thanks.
please. Good afternoon.
Hi, thank you so much for coming on board here. I thought you could give interesting perspectives, particularly, the whole Chinatown kind of
Yeah.
concept, as it were. I was hoping Patricia would be the first one to step in here. I think her study and her research on the portrayal of Chinese in Indian cinema. Navnidhi, I'm quite sure you're aware of all that, and particularly her reading of Hakikat and so on. So I'm really, first of all, just to say, great. I think these are areas of investigation and research which need to be brought out more. People are not, I mean, particularly if we come into the 21st century, people are just not aware of this huge, you know, background and huge, very, very complex engagement society at the societal level, working itself through films that existed between India and China. So what I found interesting, and as Abhijit said, that these are things which we really don't know, we don't think about, and particularly in this day and age when everything is about strategy and zero-sum games and geopolitics and so on. This is really something that you can explore with great profit, particularly from a scholarly perspective. Now, I'm just making 2 points. I mean, you can react to them or just see how it fits into the whole argument, because you are looking at things very differently. The entire portrayal, say in the late 50s, before the war, is quite mixed in the sense that you have the wily Chinese, okay, the avaricious, the the one after money, not so much really in evil in a political sense. It's more about social dynamics and how the China man, as it were, is money making, money pursuing, and basically very avaricious. So it's not really the villainy of a kind which is about predating on women or something as such. It's more like from that perspective. Whereas when you come into the portrayal of the Chinaman, quote unquote, post 62, it suddenly becomes an evil of a very different kind. And as I said, I read Patricia's writings on this with great interest. So the whole nationalistic element comes into the films, which is missing in the 50s. In fact, I could ask whether the Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai kind of a hangover did get reflected. Was there anything of that bohemi which could have been projected into the cinema socially? Because there was this larger, very positive framework of the India-China relationship. So after the 60s, there is no social element in the portrayal of the Chinese. It's nationalistic, it's from security perspectives, and it's all about the scheming villains with eyes on our territory. Okay, so these are extremely, extremely black and white, and not complex kind of portrayals at all. Whereas I would say that the 50s had a much more complex, much more diverse projection of human nature. So that's the limited kind of points I was trying to make. Thank you so much. It was fascinating listening.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that. Thanks for all the wonderful things you said and for your question. So some chapter that I'm trying to write. So the stuff I had to cut, obviously, I think my presentation was overlong, but there was stuff I cut, and some of it I was actually to do with what you're asking me. The late 50s portrayal, right? Late 50s, again, the only actor I know from who had a sustained career, right, is Musa Chang, which is why I follow for the period that I'm looking at least for this presentation, I follow his career. And in the late 50s, and actually through the 50s, he comes in a lot of films about smuggling. Now smuggling or crime genre, we call it the crime genre, right? And in the films from the 50s, everyone is always typecast. The heroes are always the heroes. The villains are always the villains. K.N. Singh, for those of you who know who the actor is, K.N. Singh is in almost every film. He's the smuggler boss, right? And Musa Chang is in his posse. So and you're right. Like in the 50s, then this representation, the smuggling film is really central to Bombay cinema, because smuggling is really central to Bombay. You see smuggling not just in the 50s, you see it in even if as far as the 70s, if you follow Diwar. And in fact, if you follow it right up to the 90s with Agnipath Kanchachina, right, he's a smuggler. Kanchachina, there's a great article on Kanchachina, which I can speak about separately, not mine, but on how he's located in well, anyway. So what I mean to say is he comes in the smuggling films. He is, you can say they are criminals. K.N. Singh and the gang, right? The smugglers, they are criminals, but it's not what happens after 62, naturally. They are, like you said, elevated to the level of a kind of national villainy, right? So now the first part of it, the 50s, I did track throughout the 20th century. Something that newspapers did a lot was talk about how there's a lot of opium smuggling, cocaine smuggling, and the way the colonial newspapers make it seem, which is really ironic, and I'll say why it's ironic, is that, oh, the Chinese are doing all the smuggling, right? They take a minority and then they find a small aspect of that minority as being that the British were the real big time smugglers. Like, that entire empire was built on smuggling. The Bombay, the entire city is built on smuggling, but they made this kind of like racialized caricature. So as I wrote about the 50s, I was like, well, why do I think, what is the difference between, the henchman played by Musa Chang and K.N. Singh? They're both always smugglers. But the difference is that there is a historical baggage attached one of those and not to the other, right? A social construction who it's within the pages of newspapers and magazines that kind of that the character it carries along, right? So but of course after 62 you do have a different kind of a national, and which the story which everybody knows. But I also think when we look at someone like Api Chang, right, like he's just a guy in a bar. He's just a goon in a bar, like in that way. So they do slip in and out of that identity, which I think it kind of like gives us a little more space to think beyond just nation and and identity, racial identity, which gives us more to work with. I feel almost. To your question about Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, so the conclusion I'm coming to is that there are two spheres. There is the elite political sphere in which there is conversation about, talk about anti-colonial solidarity, Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai. And there is this commercial popular sphere where nobody has the time, it's stunt films, right? Like the films I showed, Chini Sahukar, whatever. These are films that are made on a low budget really quick. None of the characters, if we could have seen them, we've seen like success films from later. These are films that are quickies, right? They're made quickly, they move fast, they're about thrills, and they are about, nobody has the time to like think about the inner world of the characters. They make caricatures, and that's how that, it's a commercial form. We have to think about the form. So it's about these two. I feel like the understanding of China was cleaved into two. There was the popular and the commercial, and then there was this elite political sphere. The two kind of tragically blur in 1962, when suddenly like all kinds of villainy is ascribed, to the Chinese figure. But yeah, that, I don't know if that makes sense, but that's generally what I'm working with. So yeah, I think, I hope I addressed some of that.
Oh, sure. Thanks. No. I think
I
the
think
difference has come up.
Patricia ma'am also has raised a question. So, Navneeti, please. The chat box, Bharat, what
Yeah,
is it?
sir.
Oh, I see it. The question is, are there any reciprocal images of South Asians in Chinese or Hong Kong cinema? Yeah, thank you for that question. I feel like that is a whole another project that I will spend time doing, and I will have to find out. But I mean, I anticipate this question always, but I feel like it would, yeah, I don't know. I
Well,
have no doubt, but I wouldn't know.
well, one thing at a time. This is fine. It was a absolutely wonderful piece that you presented, and such a lot of detective work in a very unusual way. I mean, the basic facts most of us know, but you brought them to life as well as to celluloid life. So that is very special. But, the role of the Parsis, of course, was very important in throughout Southeast Asia and up to Japan in East Asia, and particularly in Hong Kong, also in Macau. And these were independent cinema making places, particularly Hong Kong cinema, where one would be wondering about images both of Chinese, of themselves in the colonial eyes, and also the role of Indians if ever they come there, and so on. What I'm saying is maybe sometime one could look for what I called a reciprocal history in the Hong Kong, Macau, and possibly also, but I doubt it, the mainland cinema. That was the one thought there, because they were so interlinked, so very importantly interlinked commercially and otherwise, that it would be worthwhile sort of looking further in that. But the other thing I wanted to say is that in your previous paper, you have produced a sort of urban social geography of, well, in reference to Indian consumerism, the nature of Delhi, and so on like that. But here I see that same interest in social and cultural urban social and cultural geography spilled up out in a very different thing, also with reference to cinema. So I think it's very exciting work coming along, and coming along very much there. So congratulations on that. You'll have us all thinking. And of course, you haven't mentioned, and few people do actually, the Chandi Chowk to China film, where, how does that fit the stereotypes we've had from Hindi Chini Bye Bye to the security sort of focused ones later on, Hakikat and so on? What genre and type is that, for instance?
Thank you so much, Patricia. I really appreciate it. And so yeah, I mean, to what you say, telling these stories, I almost didn't know how to anchor them, not just this story, but much of my project. Mostly, as I said, the abstractions of India and China, where does one actually anchor it into real life and into a real place? So with the paper that I presented last time, it was New Delhi. The paper that I presented this time is Kamatipura. And there is another chapter that I do about pulp films. I call them pulp films. They're not really called pulp films. They're actually called Bond films that come out in the late 60s that I kind of vaguely hinted at towards the end of my presentation, where I saw Musa Chang coming back in the late 60s was in these films that were ostensibly Bond films, but I actually think they're stunt films remade into Bond films. But that's a conversation for another day. And that chapter is actually rooted in the geographies of old Delhi, where the world is like pulp novels. I mean, I guess the vague kind of argument that's still vague because I'm still writing it, that I'm making is that those films are made only because there is a realization that there is a real market for these kind of adventures of the spy kind, that is an appetite that has already been whetted by a publication industry in Old Delhi since the 1950s. Which traces its kind of like its lineage to a history of translation in Urdu of Sax Rohmer and his ilk. But anyway, what I mean to say is Chandni Chowk to China probably finds a home in that chapter. What genre that film is, I think that's just it's a quote unquote Bollywood film. It's everything. It's the kind of the coming together of many masala elements over time and becoming this glossy product called Bollywood that comes in in the early 2000, what it was, I think it's the mid 2000s, yes, the first decade. So yeah, no, everyone asks me about that film. I still need to know what it is that I want to say about that film. But yeah.
So,
Yeah.
any more
We have
question?
one more question, sir. Yes, sir. So this question is by William Fuse, and he writes that, do we see China through these film? Did they make or remake the reality of China in India? That's it.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. So, do we see China? I'll just take the early films because that's what I discussed, at least in the presentation today. Do we see China? No, not really. So I spoke about the stunt genre. That one is lost. There's also the fantasy genre. Like I think that one is a kind of maybe a better example for me to explain about seeing China. The fantasy genre. Everyone thinks in like Hindi cinema, like everyone tracks it back to Falke. But the work of scholars like Rosie Thomas have shown that the first films to be made were actually these Arabian Nights, Orientalist kind of films. So when you have Aladdin, or when you have other Persianate legends like Gulru Zarina, those stories actually, we think they open in Arabia, but they actually open in China. There was, I don't remember the opening line, but something like there was once a king of China. They lie actually, that imagination somewhere between India and China. Right. So we can see some of the later films from the 50s, but the early ones are lost. But what I mean to say is, for example, I was trying to track down this one called Gulru Zarina. It's a lost film again. And so I tried to track it down and I found out that a Parsi theater company performed it in Bareilly in the late 1800s. And then these Nautankis were made on it. Sorry, I'm taking the circuitous route through this one. But the Nautanki, and I was like, okay, it's going to describe China, right, at some point. And so I come across this little poem, and it describes how beautiful China is. It says, those fountains and the birds are chirping and the something and the something, I never want to leave this place. And I thought to myself, but you never told me what it really looks like, right? And then I realized it's because China becomes this amorphous kind of thing that exists only in the mind's eye. So do we see China? They never really travel to China, but they have all these like different ways by which they make a China. And presumably many of these films would have made sets and such, but I doubt they would have had the budgets to go to China and shoot there. So we would have seen a version of it, whatever remains.
Sir, please unmute yourself.
Any more question, or I think
No, sir. There are no more
fine.
questions in the
Okay,
chat
so
box.
thank you. Wonderful discussion also from Professor Alka, Professor Patricia. And I think, yeah, we are talking of a few years back, we were talking also about the India-China joint production. When the before the COVID, actually, before the COVID, we were talking of India-China joint production of films. So let us see the situation if slowly coming into the track with a lot of from the last year we have seen. So again, thanks Navnidhi. We are all enriched, I think, from this kind of presentation, which is almost new to many of us. And as Professor Alka also mentioned, that we hope that in future also we can come more like this kind of topics or this kind of discussion. Uh, Besides the military, besides the strategy, these are also a very much important component of India-China cultural and India-China people-to-people exchanges. So once again, thanks all in this session. And Navnidhi, Bharat, thank you. So I think, yeah, Bharat, we can.
Thank you, Chair. I seek your permission to formally bring an end to today's session. Chair?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. So with this, we come to the end of today's seminar. We thanks our speakers, Ms. Navnidhi Sharma, and our chair, Professor Avijit Banerjee, for gracing today's seminar with their presence and giving us their valuable time. We also thank the audience for joining us today. The video of today's discussion shall be available on the ICS YouTube channel. We would like to invite you to the upcoming Wednesday seminar scheduled for 23rd of July. Further information regarding the event can also be found on the ICS website. You may also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.